Resident Evil vs. Silent Hill, the two icons of the genre. When it comes to the horror genre, Resident Evil and Silent Hill need no introduction. They're as iconic for fans of survival horror as Call of Duty and Battlefield are to fans of first-person shooters. They both have distinctive identities and scratch a different kind of itch for gamers, but that doesn't stop people from comparing the two against each other. And honestly, at a surface level, they do seem pretty similar due to their graphics, tone, and third-person perspectives. Now, we're all thinking it, so I'll say it. Whether you're a fan of Resident Evil, a fan of Silent Hill, or both, it's natural to sometimes wonder which of the two is better, or if it's even possible to pick a winner out of the two. And that's the topic today. We're going to put the two titular horror franchises against each other and see which one comes out on top. The similarities. Let's start with the easiest section, analyzing what they have in common. As the two franchises belong to the same genre, no matter how distinctive they are, it's inevitable that they have some things in common. The first and most obvious thing the two franchises have in common is that they both started out as third-person survival horror games with fixed camera angles, gloomy atmospheres, and fairly slow gameplay. The first four mainline Resident Evil games followed this formula very consistently, and then the prequel, Resident Evil 0, also did the same. On the other hand, the Silent Hill games consistently followed this structure for the first four mainline games as well. Due to being 3D horror games on the PlayStation 1 and later two eras of gaming, they both looked pretty similar to each other too. If you haven't played the two and just saw pictures, you might think they're the same thing. The other similarities are much smaller, such as gameplay requiring resource management, and a reliance on tense atmospheres that attempt to stress the player. But if we're being honest, you can say this about almost every game in the genre. After all, Resident Evil is often credited for contributing heavily to the blueprint of survival horror game design that many developers follow even today. Now that we have this out of the way, let's analyze what sets these games apart and which is the better one. The major differences between Resident Evil and Silent Hill. Despite the fact that the two franchises belong to the same genre, they're actually pretty different. Let's start with the story and setting. Every Resident Evil game is about killing zombies and mutated experiments created through science. While the series defies all logic and realism in more ways than one, they still try to stay grounded in terms of the creatures that you fight, as all of them have one explanation or another for existing. There are no supernatural or psychological aspects at play, which means that if you can see it, you can kill it. This makes the games very tense and often action heavy, but not necessarily very scary. The horror part of Resident Evil is in keeping you at the edge of your seat and occasionally dropping a jump scare or two. Other than that, you're more focused on killing things than feeling afraid of them for the most part. This is true for at least a majority of the series. On the other hand, Silent Hill, which came out a few years after the first Resident Evil game, took a fairly different approach. The Silent Hill games can be best described as a personal hell for all of its protagonists. All of the games are about the characters being stuck in supernatural-based situations where they have to confront their darkest fears and be psychologically tested. It deals with themes of trauma, abuse, religious cults, violence, assault, body horror, and other serious topics. And it's tonally more serious too, unlike Resident Evil that doesn't shy away from being purposefully cheesy at times. Sure, we have the secret dog endings in Silent Hill, but they're completely optional and non-canon, whereas Resident Evil drops a Jill sandwich every now and then in the actual story. So both tonally and in terms of story, Silent Hill takes itself more seriously and is built around the supernatural, and it tries to scare the player using psychological horror rather than putting you in tense combat situations with machine guns and grenade launchers. Meanwhile, with Resident Evil, even when you think there's a supernatural element involved, they just reveal it was caused by an experiment or a virus instead of ghosts and goblins. And that means you can use a bazooka to blow up the most menacing foe too, and knowing that you can do that makes you feel less scared. Even Resident Evil's biggest fans admit that it has a B-movie feeling to it, which they love. The gameplay. After the story and setting, the gameplay itself greatly sets the two series apart greatly. Since the threats you face in Resident Evil are born out of bioterrorism rather than the supernatural, the series is a bit action-oriented. Some games have slower pacing, while others are faster. But even in the slower ones, the combat sections are usually pretty straightforward, and even your knife can kill most things if you practice enough. Resource management is a major element, as you'll constantly have to manage your limited inventory slots for puzzle items, health items, guns, and ammunition. And the puzzles are mostly just about knowing when to use what item, as the solutions themselves aren't particularly complicated. The atmosphere has realistic locations such as police stations, streets overrun by zombies, mansions, labs, and so on. The gameplay relies on making you feel tense due to how there is a threat lurking in every corner, sometimes even off camera, and how difficult it can be to conserve your health items and ammunition. You can soft lock yourself if you use too many things too quickly, and since even the number of times you can save is limited, there is an extra tension when it comes to taking risks and exploring. Silent Hill, on the other hand, has slower gameplay, and the enemies that you face are built to be more psychologically disturbing to look at. There is usually a lot of context behind the enemies that you see in the game, such as the nurses in Silent Hill 2 representing James's repressed sexual desires. You can carry story items freely without having to give them a slot in your inventory, which is helpful, but carrying health and ammo is still limited and forces you to carefully manage your inventory. Unlike Resident Evil, melee is encouraged way more even for the average player, unlike the knives in RE, which mostly helps out players who are at least a little bit skilled. The puzzles are a bit more complicated, and the atmosphere is designed to make you feel uncomfortable, so you're always preparing for the next scare, and the game manages to surprise you every now and then, regardless of the fact that the earlier games have graphical limitations. The characters in SH are also usually people who aren't used to combat and just happen to be in these situations, whereas most characters in RE are usually combatants of some kind, or at least have experience shooting a gun before. The different tones, pacing, atmospheres, types of puzzles, and combat make them feel completely different to each other. To say they're similar would be to say that The Exorcist and Night of the Living Dead are the same thing, when they're very much not. The only thing that they share are genres, and that's it. Now it's worth noting that so far we've only compared Resident Evil 0, 1, 2, 3, Code Veronica, and the Outbreak games to Silent Hill, because they're the ones that follow a similar style. Resident Evil actually branched out completely with the release of Resident Evil 4, becoming an over-the-shoulder shooter instead of what we were used to up to that point. This completely reshaped the series and ended pretty much any similarities that the games had with Silent Hill. Resource management became easier, puzzles became simpler, combat became significantly more action-oriented, and the series became less and less scary. Then when we reached Resident Evil 7, the series had yet another overhaul as it became first-person and began focusing more on horror again, but it still remained very different to Silent Hill. On the other hand, after the successful release of Silent Hill 3, the series had one failure after another. Silent Hill 4 is a very divided game that some people appreciate and others severely dislike. Then the games that came afterwards, such as Homecoming, Downpour, and so on, are considered between mediocre to bad. The franchise eventually became stagnant after that point, as they failed to stay true to their roots and also didn't manage to transition into modern trends. Things finally started to look up when the Kojima-directed PT demo came out, which is considered one of the best horror games ever made. But due to internal conflict between Kojima and Konami, the project fell apart, and the series was then dead for a very long time. Finally, Silent Hill returned with a remake of the second game, which is very similar to Resident Evil 2 remake style of gameplay camera perspective, but again, it's quite a different experience because it has its own identity. And then we had Silent Hill F, which continues to take the series in a different direction, combining melee action with psychological horror and a unique Japanese setting set decades into the past. The sound design. After the visual design and gameplay, the sound design is about the most important part of any horror experience, whether it's a movie or a video game. Resident Evil's sound design is exactly what you'd expect it to be. Mysterious, slow music that beautifully sets up the atmosphere, and at times of action, it can be pretty intense. But there is a B-movie vibe that the game's sound design brings to the table, thanks to its cheesy voice acting, sometimes awkward dialogue, and at least in the older games, we had a few pieces of music that did not really fit the game that they were in. Silent Hill, on the other hand, takes itself seriously in this aspect as well. The sound design is much more carefully crafted and lacks the B-movie vibe that you'd find in Resident Evil, since the SH games feature mysterious and dreaded environments full of fog and abominations. The music is designed to make the player feel tense and uncomfortable. There are several iconic pieces of music from the series that people listen to even today, and even the simpler stuff in the background still does a good job at setting up the atmosphere. So which franchise is better? Resident Evil or Silent Hill? Picking a favorite among these two pioneers of the survival horror genre comes down to preference rather than any objective opinions. Resident Evil is more about mastering your environment and resources and then utilizing what you've learned to beat the game, while While the story and characters often take themselves seriously, the overall presentation of the series tends to be a bit cheesy at times, and people often place personal challenges during their gameplay to make them more intense, such as using only specific weapons or avoiding certain ways to kill bosses faster. Don't get me wrong, Resident Evil does have its fair share of scares, especially when you're playing most of the games for the first time, especially when it comes to being chased around by Mr. X in Resident Evil 2 and its remake, or Nemesis in the original Resident Evil 3. But once you figure out the right ways to avoid these threats, it becomes more of a nuisance than something you're scared of. This is further removed in games like Resident Evil 4, 5, 6, Revelations 1, and even a bit in RE Village, as they're more action-oriented than something meant to scare you. Although they did try with Lady Dimitrescu and her daughters in Village, fans ended up wanting to date them rather than escape them due to their character design instead. Silent Hill is something that actively tries to be scary and disturbing. The themes that it deals with are more mature and traumatic, and the psychological horror aspect is something that can make you feel disturbed even on your subsequent playthroughs, and not just the first. The body horror in particular is something that makes people uncomfortable, and the exploration is scarier than Resident Evil because you never know what kind of abomination hides behind the fog that engulfs your environment. With Resident Evil, you know it's either going to be a zombie or something like a tyrant. But with Silent Hill, the developers always take more liberties, and you often have no idea what kind of a monstrous being you'll come across. The gameplay of both franchises is very fun, and it really just depends on what you personally prefer. And of course, in most cases, people just play and enjoy both games because why limit yourself to one type? When you feel like shooting big, scary experiments, Resident Evil is the way to go. When you want to explore, solve difficult puzzles, and face creepy monsters, Silent Hill is your destination. The graphics are about the same for both franchises in terms of quality, and you can see that both Capcom and Konami try their best to make them look as good as possible depending on what console that the game is on, so there's no one better or worse in this regard. As for the sound design, I have a slight preference for Silent Hill for its consistency, but Resident Evil's music is pretty good too. There are people who still have the save room themes as their ringtone from RE games that came out almost 3 decades ago, so that's a testament to how good some of the music in the games is. So again, it comes down to what you personally like. The only point that I'll give to Resident Evil without saying it's subjective is that Resident Evil as a franchise is far more consistent. Yes, they change the gameplay type every once in a while, and some of the games weren't that great, but there are far more great titles in there than otherwise, and every time they fumble, they get right back up with an improved sequel, whereas every Silent Hill game after the first 3 was very polarizing, and it took ages for us to finally get to Silent Hill 2 Remake and Silent Hill F, which are critically well received. But even with this, we had 2 recent projects that received polarizing to negative reception, which were Silent Hill Ascension and Short Message. With time, if Konami manages to play their card right, this might end up becoming more balanced. But for now, hands down, Resident Evil as a franchise is going much stronger. But regardless of its troubled history, Silent Hill is still considered one of the greatest survival horror franchises, and the first 3 games have an amazing reputation. So while we can say RE is currently better as a franchise, you can't say any RE game is better than Silent Hill. And you can't say that a Silent Hill game is better than an RE game either. They're different strokes for different folks, and there are those who enjoy both at the same time as well. What's your opinion on this? Do you think RE is better or SH? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see similar videos, then don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon for notifications.